Welcome to another episode of Heretics Against Heresy, where we hope to share what we learn, inspire others, and create faithful students of the Word. I'm Ken, along with my daughter, Sabrina.
Hello there.
So today's episode, we're covering an interesting topic called the Atheist Church, and yes, this thing does exist.
It seems like it's an oxymoron, but it is real, and it is a growing movement in especially the United States and Europe.
Okay, so first let's talk about, we always like to define these terms, right? So atheism is a biblical adjective based on the word atheos. It occurs only once in the New Testament in Ephesians 2:12, and it was translated to without God, and it signifies an idolatrous religious state, not the state of atheism as we commonly understand. This is according to the Wycliffe Bible Encyclopedia. Another interesting tidbit, an organization called the American Association for the Advancement of Atheism, which is incorporated in New York State in 1925, and in 1929 the League of Militant Atheists was organized to carry out, quote, the communist aim of destroying religious foundations of old society. So, interesting backgrounds. They may or may not be relevant to all of what we're talking about today, but, who do you think these people really are today?
Before I get into that, I do want to point out one thing, that this group called the American Atheists, who are largely concerned with the separation of church and state, define atheism as this. They say atheism is not an affirmative belief that there is no God, nor does it answer any other question about what a person believes. It is simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods. Because they say that to disbelieve in gods or deny gods is asserting that there's a foundation based on God, but to say that is a lack of belief in God, they're very careful with their wording, is not basing anything on a God existing. So I think that's an interesting tidbit in how they wish to define themselves. But I think atheists, especially in America, are some of the people that call themselves, particularly the religious nuns,
Yep.
who really aren't affiliated with any religion. And I think it's also, you could say, those who maybe grew up with a church background especially, and don't really go anymore, don't believe, especially those that grew up in a Catholic background where they were just taken through the system. And this happens in Protestant churches too, but I think it particularly happens in Catholicism where it's more of a
fit in and, just turn to something, because ultimately there's also people who are deniers who want some kind of human acceptance. So,
and I think too, with the rise of science since the Industrial Revolution, but particularly throughout the 20th century, I think we are trying to draw away from the need to have a God. I think in the 19th and 18th century and before that, there was much more of a reliance upon God, since we were relying largely upon what the land could provide us with to survive. But now we're much more reliant upon what we have built and what the technologies we have created. So I think it's much easier now in today's world to see ourselves as creators as opposed to God as providing for us.
Yeah, and I think there's a few societal shifts, right? Society accepts evil, whether you want to believe it or not. You just look at the music industry, you look at Hollywood, you look at these award shows, the imagery, even at the halftimes of the Super Bowl, the Olympics. There's a lot of planted imagery in there that is dark and evil, and and it's not even it's hiding in plain sight now, right? And so years ago, this stuff was always hidden, and now it's out in the open. I think there was a time in the country where, especially depending on what part of the country you grew up in, if you were not a churchgoer, you were an outcast, right? There were especially, think about the Bible Belt, right? People all went, growing up here in the Northeast, it wasn't the same, but still, I think it was still something that most people still expected. But ultimately, these people still have a need to be accepted somewhere, right? I mean, it's a common human need. So, any comment on that before we talk about the decline of the church?
I think just that comment about human need to be accepted is, I think, interesting, because I feel that you get beyond like physical needs of like you need, food, water, oxygen, that kind of thing to survive. That needing to be accepted and feel loved is something that is very high in the list of things that you need to survive. And I think that's probably something that if you talk to people who have depression and things like that, that's something that they struggle with the most, I think.
Yeah, and I think you're referring to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the first two levels are basic human needs, biological safety, but then love and belonging are the first psychological needs, and then above that is esteem, which is also psychological. So it's interesting that they relate to these first two psychological needs and not necessarily physical needs. So one of the things you can look at is the decline in the church over the decades. And from the 1950s through the 1960s, 40 to 50% of American adults attended regular weekly services. Time of high attendance. A lot of people went. Some consider the 1950s the Third Great Awakening, and so there was a resurgence. But then, of course, the 1960s had a little bit of societal change, which we're not going to get into here. But I think everyone understands the impact the 60s had on culture in the world, even today. So by the time we got to 1970s, attendance declined, right? And now 35 to 40% of adults were attending religious services on a regular basis. And, we start to see more secularized culture, shifting in attitude. And then you go from the 1990s, 2000s, it stayed stable. And then with 2010s to the present, we have another decline. And again, now we're talking about 30 to 35% of Americans attend on a regular weekly basis. And now we're talking about shifts based on generations, changing attitudes towards religion. And again, to your point earlier, the rise of the nuns. So a few things on church decline. Any commentary there?
Yeah. Another comment that I do want to make is that I think a lot of this can partially also be attributed to the way that we receive information now. Before, like at the beginnings of the 50s and 60s, the way that we understood things, it was still primarily through reading. I'm reading this book for school currently called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. And this most recent chapter that I just read was talking about how religion is played out in TV. This is written, I think, before the internet really made a foothold. But he was mentioning about how if you put religion on TV, it strips it of some of the depth that it needs to have because it needs to be compartmentalized and it needs to be entertaining. But whereas religion is much deeper and it's not meant to be entertaining, and it's also like Christianity is concerned with what you need and what is good for you. You need to recognize that you are a sinner. You need to come to Jesus to repentance, not what you want. What you want is seen as sinful, but what you want is what is broadcast on TV and on the internet largely today. So I think this too can in some ways plays into the way that people are leaving religion and also having a more superficial level of religion.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point because it becomes a pastor who becomes the cult of personality, and you think about those who have big followings, both in their church but online, and you look at people like Joel Osteen are on TV, and goes on talk shows. I think is so far from the truth on so many ways, which we don't want to get into, but he draws a lot of people, and so that kind of a experience is what people want, right? And then they go to their local church, and there's a pastor preaching from the Word, and he's not quite as engaging and exciting, and he tells you about all the parts of the Bible that Joel and others don't want to tell you about, right? It becomes a choice for some. Mm-hmm. Interesting, actually, this year, Pew Research did a study. This was in March of this year. It says that 8 out of 10 in the studied here say that religion is losing influence in public life. Also, Religious News Service had an article where they said the decline in religious engagement over the past 15 years is twice as bad as the decline in the 60s and 70s. So, we're seeing a rapid decline, in these shifts. So it's going to be an interesting ride. Any commentary there, Sabrina?
I think not really. I think a lot of it is just more statistics to support the kind of things that we I think see philosophically that are now being played out in numbers and polls and things like that.
Yeah, it's almost like the religion of choice, or I'm going to find the kind of message that I like that's nice and fits what I want, and it becomes my own personal God that I'm feeding and not the God of the Bible. So interesting. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the groups we found.
Yeah, so a lot of these groups, they meet on Sundays. Some seem to meet more regularly every week. A lot of the ones I found only meet once a month. They sing songs, like you would do in a traditional church service. They generally sing like pop songs, that kind of thing. They hear a message. They talk about things generally in science, especially. I find a lot of these atheist churches are heavily focused on science as their messages, and some of the topics don't sound uninteresting. One was about, that I found was about how worms work for our ecosystem. Another one I found was about preparing for the future and people that predict the future, such as Nostradamus, and that was interesting. I thought they had some mildly interesting topics when they talk about them. But the thing is, it's eerily similar to church, and I'm reading this and I'm like, yes. I find that it's interesting that a lot of people want to escape the church environment so much and dislike the fact that church is just religion, and they don't like the way that word sounds and the connotations that word may have, yet they will go to a service that is structured almost the exact same way as a church, but without God.
Yeah, it is interesting. The Sunday Assembly, right, in their statements, they say they have no deity, there's no doctrine, and they are radically inclusive. So, it's kind of like the flypaper for anyone who just, wants to show up and hang out with others. I'm troubled by the fact that, they build mere organizations. They have a structure, they have a leadership. Clearly if they have a location, they're paying for it. There's funds that are needed, so they have to collect money, right? So they do all the things the church does without having God in it, but okay. Any other ones you found that were...
The other thing I found is there's an atheist church in Seattle called the Seattle Atheist Church. It seems to be one of the ones that's rather big. They meet weekly, but I found what was interesting is before church, they get together and read a passage from the Daily Stoic, which is based off of, obviously, Stoicism, and they discuss it as you would do with a Bible study before church. And I just find some of this stuff really interesting, like just from the outside looking in as someone who does all these things with surrounded by God and Christianity, but they're doing these things with surrounded by science and themselves. And I find, is that depressing? Like, do they go home after these events and find themselves sad that this is all that there is, or
Right.
how do they feel?
I don't get it. We talked about the American Atheist, touched on it, but the thing that blows my mind is they have a board of directors. They actually have a staff, so that means people are being paid. So that means people are contributing, and so it's no different, right? The American atheists say they're not a belief system or a religion, and they basically say they attract people who are humanists, free thinkers, and these are not my words, theirs, mind you, cultural Catholics, and those who lack a belief in God. Then you're an atheist. So interesting how they cast their net.
And to that point, they strongly encourage the use of the word atheist. They say using words such as humanist, secular, bright, and free thinker can are used, and there's ways that people self-identify, but they suggest using the word atheist because they think it is the term that people best understand. They say that you shouldn't shy away from your atheism, which I found was interesting because there are, I think, a lot of people that will say that they're agnostic to not fully deny the existence of God, because I think that does take a lot of faith in science and in yourself and in the society around you to not believe in God.
Yeah, and the American atheists actually say that the agnostics are a weaker version of atheists, and I agree with that. I mean, I think that they tend to be people who don't want to full out say they're atheists because people will kind of look at you funny, but they don't necessarily, look, if I wasn't sure, I would take the time to figure it out. Right, I'd make that my priority to either understand and believe or to completely reject it, because that middle ground doesn't matter. And if you're going to be in the middle ground, you're not saved anyway. So you might as well either figure out where you really stand, or hopefully you have a chance of figuring out that God is real and does exist. So another one I came across was Oasis Network. I don't know if you found them.
Yes, I did.
They like to celebrate the human experience, and they say they are not an atheist church because it is an oxymoron, as we've alluded to, so that was interesting. Anything from them that you wanted to pull out?
I just think it's funny that they say they're not an atheist church because it's an oxymoron. I just think it's funny because they will say, oh, we're not an atheist church, but yet they'll do everything that a church does, but without God.
Right.
Which, in a sense, is impossible, obviously, but...
Yeah, the other thing they say that atheist implies there's no dogma involved, okay, but then they say churches are dogmatic. Maybe if you're in a liturgical church, you don't like the pomp and circumstance, but there are many different alternatives. There's going to be an order to a service. I don't care what you do. You're going to have something, but I think, if you're caught up on dogma, maybe you ought to look at something else before thinking, I'm an atheist.
It's also impossible to not have a belief system in a creed. It is impossible to believe in nothing. Even if you say that Christians are closed-minded and say, well, okay, because it's wrong to be gay, or it's wrong to do these things, that they're being closed-minded, but you are yourself asserting a dogma position by saying that it's okay, the LGBT community is great and that we should celebrate these people. You yourself are asserting a dogma. It is impossible to live with no beliefs. You ultimately have some set of beliefs that you are living by. They can be very loose, but those are ultimately a set of beliefs.
Right. They may not guide your life, right, in essence.
You may be very morally pliable.
Right.
But you have some sort of belief.
Yep. Some of the values of this Oasis is that people are more important than beliefs. Reality is known through reason. So it's not the word, but through reason. Meaning comes from making a difference in the world, and humans will solve human problems, and you have to be accepting. So sound very, very progressive in their approach, and again, not a place you'll find us anytime soon or ever.
Yeah, and the thing I find also interesting about this is, especially that reality is known through reason, is how you know reality has been a huge issue in debate in philosophy. I believe it's called metaphysics, and I think thinkers and philosophers are not unified on this topic at all. And to say that reality is known through reason is one thing that has been put forth, but there have also been challenges to that in other ways through your senses. And how do you understand things if we don't understand consciousness? So to say that reality is known through reason, I think, is also a interesting way that they're trying to get you to view the world.
Right, right. One of the things that I started to think about with this whole topic was relating it to the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, 1 through 9, really specifically. The resistant heart, right? The seed on the path is really representing the atheists and even the agnostics, right? That seed was just gobbled up right away. It was hardened people. And I looked at the shallow heart, right? The seed that's on the rocky ground that maybe had some belief and fell away. These are probably people who either didn't fit into the congregation, didn't find a church that they kind of should be in, and just kind of said, why, threw their hands up and said, why am I doing this, right? At the moment that, an opportunity presented itself. And then I looked at the seed among the thorns, and these are the distracted hearts, and these are the people like the religious nuns who don't like the messages that are in the Bible. They don't particularly like the things that there's obedience, there's, they want to follow their own will, and so they create their own self-image as God, and that's kind of what happens. And a lot of these people are really sitting in those churches, right? They're kind of on the fence, but they're going through the motions. Thought there?
Yeah, another thing is with the atheist church, I think it highly depends on how do you view church? What do you view it as being for? Because I think a lot of the things when I look at the atheist church, they're trying to find a sense of belonging. They're trying to find a community. And if you see church as that, which it obviously does give you a community in fellowship with other believers, and it does give you a sense of belonging. But if that's the point of church, and I think you're missing the idea of what church is about. The idea of church is to come together and praise our Creator and our Master, right? And it's to learn and grow deeper in His Word so we can better be His servants on earth and to fulfill His will. And so if you're viewing church as that, I feel like an atheist church seems highly ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because what do you whose will are you fulfilling? Who are you praising? Nobody. You can only praise yourself. But if you see church as just a place to belong and a place to go and meet other people and have connection, I think an atheist church makes sense in a way.
Yeah, and I was thinking about, right, because anybody will really admit, right, that you're sitting in church and you're still sitting among people who don't necessarily truly believe, right? I mean, you have people who are going and because that's what they do and they feel belonging, and unfortunately, you have, right, as it says, right, the wheat and the tares, they grow together, and this kind of also represents what goes on in a church. I think today, though, it's become much more acceptable not to go and to reject, and so they're going to land somewhere, and they want to be connected, and that connectedness drives them to these places. So these become more about the human gathering than the worship that is necessary.
Mm-hmm. And I will say that these churches do tend to do humanitarian good.
Yep.
But I think it also stems from the fact that the highest possible thing is humanity. And the highest possible, I guess, what they worship in a sense is themselves and humanity. And I think if you look at what humanity has done and the fallen state that humanity is in, I think that's a very bleak thing to worship. If you center everything around people, and if you look at wars and all the things that humans can cause, I think that's a very depressing outlook on life.
Yes. Even
if you do feel fulfilled by doing good for other people, which I think we should, and the Bible does call us to do good and to serve and to do those things. But if humans are your highest, I think that's a really challenging.
The biggest part of that good, though, is salvation, right? And expanding that and bringing that message, right? We help people who are in need, but the other thing is, we want those to also open up opportunities to talk about and see God's love, right? So it's not just doing good for the sake of good. It's more purposeful. One is fulfilling a human need if this helps suffering, but also it exhibits Christ's love through that action that you don't get in, just straight up humanitarian aid type situations.
Right.
I looked at Psalm 14:1, right, and reminded in this one, right, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do vile deeds. There is no one who does good. And again, it just came front and center when we talk about this topic, right? You're a fool if you think there's no God or you say that. If you're not sure, there's plenty of opportunities to go talk to someone who really understands, believes, and have them help you, because you're kidding yourself, right? When all is said and done, your life is over. You're going to be in a dark place.
Right. And I even think to believe that there is a God and find out you're wrong is much better than if you believe that there is no God and then find out you're wrong. I think that's Pascal's wager.
Yep. I also reminded of this one in 2 Peter 3, verses 3 and 4. Above all, be aware of this. Scoffers will come in the last days, scoffing and following their own evil desires, saying, where is this coming that he promised? Ever since our ancestors fell asleep, all things continue as they have been since the beginning of creation. So again, this notion that, there's going to be a lot of scoffers and a lot of people pointing their fingers, and laughing at those who attend church and worship and have this belief. And, I think you see that trend in society, and it's been going on for a while, right? And I guess there's been resurgences and then, ebbs and flows of this. But, I think we're seeing a portion of society that just is much more on display. And I think your evidence of just this kind of, statement about, more and more scoffers. And, it's you need to stay strong in your faith and continue. These organizations are not going to help you, right? When it comes down to it.
Right.
Any thoughts for you before we close?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think we about covered everything.
Yep. So, we encourage you, keep reading. Don't just listen to the sermon, understand it for yourself. If you don't think it, you agree with it, dig into it, read material, learn, be the Berean, because it's the only way you're going to keep moving forward. You won't be fooled by pastors. Pastors make mistakes. I'm not saying all of them do on terms of a sermon, but there are some people who don't handle God's word carefully. And if you're not careful, you're going to be, following down a bad path. So just, continue to read. So we are thankful that you spent some more time with us. Have a blessed week, and we will catch you on the next one.